Okay, let's sort of start with me. I guess I'll go a bit of a way back. So I was born in Moscow, but I moved to Tampere as a kid, and I grew up there. In fact, our local kiosk was the location of the last lottery win, 12 million euros. So there's like a link to the previous talk right there. Yeah, so I kind of went to an international school, did my military service here, then moved to the UK, where I lived for about 10 years. And after the UK, my girlfriend at the time, now my wife, went to work in Germany, in Bonn, which is officially the most boring city in the world. And I kind of had this thing in that I'd been programming in other languages like C, C++ for a while, and I did a fair amount of Java, but around 5 years ago, I got a little bit sort of frustrated, I guess, with the complexity of development. I just wanted to hack, and I feel like the older I get, the more lazy I get as a developer. And Java didn't really, with its factory, didn't really work so well with my sort of lazy programming style. So I discovered JavaScript, and as they say, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. At the time, I was largely ignored, and I didn't really speak to anybody about my obsession. Then I kind of brought up the subject with some people I knew, and they laughed at me. And then 3 years ago, when I moved to Germany, there wasn't much fighting going on, but I did feel a bit disconnected from everybody I knew. I was working from home a lot. It got pretty messy because Bonn has 1 euro 50 kebabs. Anyway, long story short, I kind of got involved with the local JavaScript community, and it turns out Ryan Dahl of sort of Node.js fame is from there. And I gave the first talk there, and it's been an amazing journey ever since. So after that, I moved to Russia, where I co-founded Moscow.js, and about a year ago, I moved to Helsinki, and there wasn't really a JavaScript, as in the language, meetup as such. So I sort of started Helsinki.js, and we've been going strong for 13 months or so, and we have regular monthly meetups, and there's kind of the format is 50-minute talks, usually 2 to 3 of them, followed by 5-minute Q&A, followed by drinks. And so the also, I should note that one of the guys I know from Germany, from Cologne, which is near Bonn, is essentially running this site called Community.js, and it's been impressive with how quickly the number of JavaScript communities has increased over time, because I think 3 years ago there were none, 2 years ago there were about 150, I don't know where the number is now, but if you ever travel, I highly recommend that you check out communityjs.org to see if there's a local meetup, and just go check it out. I promise you it'll be amazing. Okay, so I'll try and move forward. One thing I should note is that I sort of don't think of myself as a front-end or a back-end developer. And for a long time, I sort of used to cringe when people would say, well, I'm a full-stack JavaScript developer. I'm like, either you're a developer or you're not. Don't make a distinction. And because I felt that essentially, and this is a real photo, by the way, no Photoshop. I think it's called, the site is gravityglue.com. This guy does it for fun. I just found that, unless you sort of understand the kind of the server side of things, you can't really be good at the front-end stuff, and vice versa. So I feel like saying you're a full-stack developer is almost a given if you're a good developer. And I'm really glad that sort of JavaScript has emerged as the language that lets people kind of write in one language across the board. So I don't know, do any of you have forever projects? There was a post on Hacker News about this recently. So my forever project is something that's called StartHQ, and I've been thinking about this for a couple of years now, and I've tried to re-implement it 3 times. And within the last month, I've actually managed to pull it off. So what StartHQ.com is, and you can check it out for yourself, is kind of a replacement for your new tab page. And it's something that is supposed to work within an organization so that you can actually share the web apps that you use with your colleagues. And I'm going to use StartHQ as a kind of an example, as part of a story, as I'll lead you through the different options you face as a developer. And I have to say, you face a lot of options. In fact, when you sort of dive into full-stack JavaScript development, you're faced with this maze, and you don't know if you're ever going to come out. This, by the way, is a pencil-drawn maze by a Japanese guy who spent 7 years drawing it on a A1 sheet of paper. As a kid, I managed to pull off an A4, so this is quite impressive. Yeah, and there's lots of options, and there's lots of mixed sort of advice, and there isn't any right solution to the problem. So I thought I'd kind of deconstruct it in this talk and essentially walk you through the potential pitfalls. So let's start with sort of the debate of toolkits versus frameworks, just to kind of set the scene. Essentially, the likes of Java, Rails, and so on are frameworks, whereas in JavaScript, you sort of have this tendency of having toolkits. And so a toolkit looks like this, building blocks that you assemble yourself. And kind of, if you want to have a house, say, you sort of build up the house, and then you put the figures in the house. Whereas a framework looks a little bit like this. So you get delivered a house, and then to build your app, you kind of put your figures in there. And I mean, there's a more scientific way, of course, to sort of define this, which is, a toolkit is a collection of libraries, and there's a kind of the Unix philosophy, perhaps even, of saying that libraries should do one thing and do it well. You can sort of pretend it's a Unix way of doing it. I would argue that's because of sort of the copy-paste nature of JavaScript, and that you want to keep the size of your code as small as possible, that you have this attitude with JavaScript that perhaps is lacking a lot of other languages. Like on the server, you don't care how many dependencies you pull in. As long as it runs, it's all fine. With JavaScript, you actually care about the size of your code base. Anyway, but the more sort of proper way of looking at it is, and I'm sure there's like a in Soviet Russia joke in there somewhere, but you call a library, whereas a framework calls you. So you kind of have different expectations almost. Right. So let's talk about language. I'm going to get some water first, though. So how many people here speak English? Okay, good. All right. So how many people here? How many people speak Finnish? Okay, so most of you, but not everybody. Okay, how many people say no CoffeeScript? Okay, and I presume most of you know JavaScript. So it's a little bit the same with the language that you choose. Like, obviously, I'm biased because I run the JavaScript, but I tend to be pretty open-minded about the language I use. So I think we've come a long way, since the biblical times. In that we've kind of had English emerge as the language of choice for most technical presentations, if nothing else. And although, I should say in Russia, it's quite, like Russian-speaking countries, having done a bit of stuff there, it's quite different. And actually, the effect is kind of amusing. I write for this blog occasionally called Daily.js, and I did an interview for the blog. Well, you should check it out, by the way. I did an interview for the blog, and then somebody translated it into Russian and posted it on this biggest Russian tech blog. Problem was they'd done it 1 year and a half after I'd done the interview, and they didn't mention the date of the interview, so I got a lot of flaming comments, which is quite common in Russia, actually. If you go to a Russian tech conference, you get flamed a lot. Don't even get me started on the blogs. And I couldn't really explain myself. But yeah, I mean, things are changing. There's more and more conferences. In fact, there's a conference that's going to be taking place in Minsk in Belarus that I've been invited to as a speaker. Unfortunately, for some strange reason, they only give you, they pay for the fare only one way, so you don't get sponsored for the return ticket. So I'm thinking, if anybody here wants to join me, I think there's enough of us, they'll have to let us out. I'll tweet about it through Helsinki.js later. But anyway, with languages, you sort of have this thing that, if you want to spread the word, if you want your library or whatever it is to be adopted, you have to be understood. And, my choice, and by the way, I've kind of highlighted the choices here. So for my projects, I tend to pick JavaScript. There are other languages like CoffeeScript, and there's a whole list at alt.js. But I tend to go with JavaScript because I want to be understood. I don't actually care what language a library is written in, but one thing that I sort of implore people to do is to at least provide examples in JavaScript. You'll make your developers' lives a hell of a lot easier. I actually have a funny story. I don't know how we're doing for time, but I like analogies. And when I was living in Cambridge, I was chatting to some people from ARM, and they sort of said, that we work with Nokia a lot, and Finns have this thing that whenever we're in the middle of a meeting and it's like a critical point in the discussion, they just switch to Finnish, and we don't understand what the hell's going on. And like, you've got a Russian name, but you understand Finnish. Can we like hire you to come to these meetings? So I don't know what the moral of that story is, other than that, it can be perceived as being a little bit rude if you don't speak a language that most people understand. And I'm not saying that Finnish isn't a great language. I would say it's like sort of the closure script of languages. CoffeeScript is like the text speak, so it's no different from normal language, but it's just shorter. Anyway, so you can kind of use whatever you want, but like try and be understood. Don't go too esoteric. And there's other things that are worth noting, in that there's a lot of compiled to JS languages, and some of those sort of compiled to JS languages, like Tracer, actually compile ECMAScript 6 features to JavaScript. So that's kind of cool, and I've played around with that a bit on the server. But for performance reasons and for kind of stability, it's not ideal, so I wouldn't actually use it in a real-world project. Also, there's obviously older flavors of JavaScript or ECMAScript. I guess we should say JS or ECMAScript, since JavaScript is trademarked by Oracle. But anyway, the ES5 shim is something you should consider using. So it's a shim that provides a compatibility layer, like especially array, like map, for each filter functions, which are great if you're more into the kind of the functional style of programming. But you shouldn't use it unless you actually need it. All right, so let's talk about the server. So when you talk about JavaScript on the server, most people tend to think Node.js. In fact, it's a given. But actually, there's a whole bunch of different server-side JavaScript frameworks. Now, admittedly, they're about, I did like a study on this, like 100. The most popular one is called Ringo.js, that I've contributed to at one point and do use occasionally. But it's like 1,000 times less popular by any measure than Node.js. There are also some emerging JavaScript frameworks, like that one on the bottom left. Anybody care to guess the logo for which sort of server-side platform that is? Yes, it's Meteor. So this is a company that has raised 8 million euros in funding, and that's the best they could come up with as the logo. I mean, in fact, I would argue that actually these logos are kind of representative of these three server-side JavaScript platforms. So Node has this kind of a cool, hip, sort of a high-tech, futuristic vibe going on. Clearly, Joyent has put a certain amount of effort into the branding. That thing on the bottom right is sort of the Ringo.js. So Ringo is a JavaScript kind of a framework platform that runs on top of Java. So that's actually not the official logo. That's taken from some T-shirt site, and it's kind of almost a self-deprecating joke in the sense that Ringo.js uses Rhino, which is actually quite slow, so hence the logo. Anyway, and then we've got Meteor here, and these guys are like, despite all the funding and all the hype, they're just like too cool to make a proper logo. And they're kind of off to the side from everybody else. And there are obviously others, right? If you go to commonjs.org, you can see the full list. But just to kind of separate them out a little bit, Node.js by itself isn't particularly useful. You have a wealth of libraries, and probably the first one you come across is Express or Connect, which provides like a middleware composition framework, so you can route requests, serve static files, etc. Then we've got Meteor, which actually uses Node, but for some bizarre reason it's got its own packaging system, and it's an end-to-end framework. So it's something that you sort of use both on the client as well as the server. Then you have Derby, which is like the open source equivalent of Meteor. You've got Vertex, which is the equivalent of Node.js, but on top of the JVM. And actually, Oracle is working on something they're calling Node.jar, which is going to be included in the next version. So, Node APIs on top of the JVM. Then you've got Ringo, which is kind of a synchronous as opposed to asynchronous JavaScript on top of the JVM, and the Ringo equivalent of Express is Stick. And then there's sort of this bastard child that I came up with called Common Node, which lets you write synchronous Ringo.js code or Ringo.js apps on top of Node.js. So given that I built it, I felt compelled to use it. But the reason that I'm using that instead of Ringo and the JVM is its lower memory usage, as well as the fact that there's a wealth of JavaScript libraries available that don't run on top of the JVM as is, because they've got some native bindings and so on. And also, I dislike walled gardens, right? And I felt like Meteor is this thing that locks you in. And in fact, if you sort of talk to a lot of people using Meteor, they do say that at some point you just kind of end up being stuck, and you have to put a whole amount of effort to work your way around the constraints that Meteor has put in place. All right, so let's talk about the database we use. And it's actually quite impressive the extent to which databases have, or rather, adopted JavaScript, or the extent to which JavaScript or JSON has infiltrated databases, including relational ones. So I think we've got likes of MySQL, and MySQL a lot of the time, in real-world projects, you end up storing JSON as blobs. And it's not indexable, but there's a very good, if very old blog post from the CTO of FriendFeed about how you can actually index JSON data in a MySQL database. You get all the benefits of MySQL, but as well as the benefits of having kind of a schemaless data in JSON format. Postgres has gone a step further, so there's the JSON data type, and you can actually index, essentially, JSON columns. Then we've got CouchDB that I included there because it was sort of the forerunner of NoSQL and JSON kind of document databases, although I guess it's kind of running out of steam now. Plus there's MongoDB. So I opted for MongoDB, and I guess what's interesting about Mongo is that, I don't know if anybody knows, but historically Tengen, the company behind Mongo, started out as a full-stack JavaScript platform that included the database, the front end, the server side, and everything else. And that didn't go so well. So let's hope Meteor has better luck. Although Meteor actually uses Mongo under the hood as well. OK, so it's great. We've got this data. It's in JSON. And we can do what Meteor does, which is it just gives you the Mongo shell in your browser. Now, there's obvious security implications. But actually, I feel that there's like some sort of a mismatch. You don't want to expose your underlying data model to the front end. It's much better to expose it through a kind of a RESTful or some form of API. And I think that's something that's kind of been mentioned a number of times over the course of the day. So there's Zen-like logo. Does anybody know what this logo is? Yay. All right. So let's look at the API options. So you can have RESTful JSON. You can have, which is sort of what most people do nowadays. It's what I chose as well. Then you've got bespoke sort of JSON over HTTP, so that's what GWT does. And then you have craziness like custom JSON over WebSockets. And I'm a little bit torn on this. Like, I like all the real-time stuff, but I feel that for most sort of operations that you perform, you do CRUD type things. And the guys at Meteor at conference have openly said things like, in 2 years, REST will be gone, and JSON over WebSockets will rule. But I think that's ignoring a lot of things. So, for example, if you use HTTP, you have access to all this sort of caching infrastructure. It's easier to debug. It's because you can just use the browser. There's various other benefits. And I think what's probably going to happen is kind of JSON over WebSockets is going to be delegated to the corner of kind of pub-subscribe type of APIs for pushing real-time notifications, but the bulk of apps are still going to be using REST even 10 years from now. All right, so let's talk about like the CSS or framework that we use in images. Again, some logos. As you can see, I'm obsessed. Anybody care to guess what those are? Yeah, definitely Bootstrap. And then we've got Font Awesome on the right. The thing in the middle is kind of funny. I had to kind of Google to figure out what it is, almost. Or, well, it was the other way around. So I'll include the quote. I quite like that. I think that's deep. W3C has been at work. So anyway, I mean, if you're not going to use Bootstrap, at least use normalized.css, which Bootstrap sort of includes. For the graphics, if you like cartoon type stuff, like logos, things you normally use PNGs for, it's best to use SVG, because then you can resize it without having to like get in touch with the artist. Although in my case, I was the artist, but anyway. Then, for icons, use Font Awesome, and I think in the next version of Bootstrap, it's actually going to default to using like the vector versions rather than PNGs for the icons. No, yeah, so version 3. Yeah. So, oh, by the way, there probably won't be room for like Q&A. So if you want to kind of contradict me, ask me, heckle me, just shout out. Like it's totally cool. I want this to be interactive. Okay. So moving on. Let's talk about MV star libraries or client-side frameworks. I kind of don't like framework as a word there because there's some lightweight frameworks that aren't strictly speaking frameworks and are more like a library. So the main sort of contestants are these. So jQuery or no framework. And like for a long time, I didn't think that people still wrote code without frameworks in the modern day and age, until I contacted a well-known consultancy for sponsorship saying, our next event in February in Helsinki JS is going to be about frameworks, sort of client-side frameworks. And would you guys like to sponsor, maybe bring a speaker on board? And they said, we don't use frameworks. And I thought, I kind of scratched my head and I thought this was made up, but it turns out it's actually kind of semi-true. I hope I'm not spilling too many beans here, but anyhow, you can do that. You can also use Backbone, which a lot of people are using. And that's fine, but I think a lot of things that you expect a framework to provide, Backbone is missing. So there's like frameworks or like helpers on top of Backbone, like I think Marinette is one, and there's a few others. And then we have this sort of new breed of frameworks or libraries that are kind of support two-way data binding. So they also include templates as part of them. So Angular is one, Knockout is another, Ember is third. I actually spent like an hour trying to find an Ember logo that didn't have an animal, and I failed. And I couldn't be bothered like Photoshop it out, so it's there. There's like this parallel thread running through this whole presentation, by the way, which is logos. I don't know if anybody noticed it, but every single logo of an open source project has an animal. And I don't know why. Maybe there's like an official register of animals you can choose and pick from. Or maybe it's the O'Reilly books. Another thing that's kind of confusing, and I think we should do something about it, is whether you spell things .js in lowercase or JS in uppercase. There isn't like a consensus here. And I feel like we'd do everyone a favor if somebody just registered the .js TLD now that they're presumably available, and then just let any open source JavaScript project register the domain. Then we'd all have lowercase .js as project names. Anyway, so the choice is yours to be made, and I don't think there's like a clear winner. Either case, there's pros and cons that I'll touch upon. The project I chose was, or the library I chose was Angular. And if you want to find out more, so the next meetup, which is hopefully going to go ahead, is going to be about this. So we're going to have a different format. We're going to have like small presentations to the different MVC frameworks, followed by a panel discussion, which I'll moderate because clearly I'm not biased. So, Google Trends. When you don't know which open source project to pick, go with Google Trends. I don't know what this means, to be honest, but just thought I would throw it out there. Because you do have this sort of hype, Gartner hype cycle, right? I mean, all technologies goes through this, and actually, Google Trends maps nicely to the Gartner hype cycle. So Backbone is kind of coming off the hype cycle. Angular just maybe has more velocity, so it's kind of shot up through, but probably people are going to become disappointed with it sooner or later. What's also interesting is if you run this through Google Trends, then you kind of can see which countries the different frameworks are popular in. And Angular is US only. Not a whole lot talk about Angular outside of the US or the Valley. Others are surprisingly popular in other countries. Like Knockout is a runaway success in Russia for some reason. All right, so let's talk about templating, just very briefly. Again, lots of options. I thought I would show a couple of logos here. It's a bit of a joke. So there's basically you choose not to use templates, so you can do something like that. You can kind of create your own DSL that generates the DOM and have these global functions, which I've done in the past, and I know that some people are still doing, still using today. Then you can use underscore templates, which come with Backbone. So a lot of people kind of use them for example apps anyway. Then you can go completely logicless with Mustache, or if you're not quite certain, then you can have handlebars, which brings logic to Mustache, which is a logicless templating library. So that's how things look if you use Mustache, and it's very fast. I mean, all you're really doing is string concatenation. A project worth mentioning is one called Transparency by the guys from Leonidas, who are up in Tampere. And what that does is it lets you use your sort of DOM, or like your HTML as the templating language. So you just add extra attributes to kind of, repeat things and so on. And that's very similar to what AngularJS does. So Angular has its own kind of HTML-based templating solution. All right, so we've talked enough about Angular, so I thought I would sort of kind of dive into it and say, what is Angular, why is it cool, and what are the benefits? So Angular is a bit like this, or at least that's how I felt about it before I started looking deeper into it. So Angular is essentially what HTML would have been had it been designed for building web apps. And the problem is that with most real-world web apps, you spend about 80% of the time, or 81, clearly it's a very scientific kind of figure, but with manipulating the DOM. And the nice thing about Angular is it makes that go away. So with two-way data binding, you don't have to worry about the DOM, and you can basically just have your HTML templates, you can have your data, you can have kind of controllers that bind and have that functions that get triggered when some action happens within the view, and that's it. You don't have to worry about, oh, where do I insert this, and how do I populate this template with the right data, and so on. It's worth a closer look. It is a little bit scary because it essentially means that you're kind of throwing out everything that you've been taught about, like not putting logic in templates. But it's also very powerful, kind of like JavaScript is powerful in the way that Shotgun is powerful. You can shoot yourself in the foot if you're not careful. Angular templates are kind of the same. It's very tempting to put a lot of logic into the views, but if you kind of play it cool, you can start out by having the logic in the views, just like you can just put everything in the global scope in JavaScript, and then you can gradually kind of refactor it out, move the logic out. But what that means is it's awesome for prototyping, right? And the canonical sort of AngularJS demo app is something where you have like a paragraph or like a text span, and then you have an input field, and you type stuff into the input field, and it magically appears, possibly somehow processed in the span. And that's kind of a bit of a lousy example because you rarely do that. Most of the thing that it's useful for, though, is sort of this logic that's unnecessary that's there for dealing with the DOM. But I have to say that, Angular is most definitely a framework. If anything is a framework, Angular is one, because it includes a bunch of stuff. Like it's got its own templating, it's got its own module system, it's got dependency management, it's got promises, which, by the way, you should use for doing flow control. If you're not using promises or something like reactive extensions, Bacon.js, like think twice. It's got kind of great support for testing. You can also have directives, which allow you to kind of overwrite or almost create like your own HTML tags that have some functionality attached to them. So W3C is working on something called web components that Angular is kind of almost a precursor to. It does kind of history push state stuff for you, and it can also have interceptors and do HTTP requests. In fact, Angular is standalone, so you don't even need jQuery, right? But if you do include jQuery, then it uses the jQuery selector engine. And if you want to use some like jQuery plugins or components, you can do that. Like you can wrap jQuery UI components in directives, and there's already been some work done on that. But as a result of having all this stuff, it is a bit sort of scary. And I've sort of stolen this from somebody else, but this is pretty much the cycle that you go through when you start using Angular. And I'm at one of those peaks at the moment, so you kind of caught me at a good time. But I'm sure I'll sort of end up going off that peak sooner or later. All right, so we talked about Angular having its own module system, but really there's kind of two major standards for doing modules, right? There's the common JS way, which is what Node uses, which is kind of very synchronous. And essentially, if you want to use that on the client, it requires a compile step. Or there's the required JS way. And a lot of people are using required JS. And to be honest, I don't understand why. I don't get it. I mean, it's an extra level of indentation. It behaves completely differently, when you do development from when you run it minified. And really, it doesn't seem that performant. It's actually hard to follow because you sort of have your dependencies, like the names, and then the actual local names of those dependencies completely separate from each other. So I prefer the common JS style. Another thing to note is that if you use like a JavaScript library like jQuery UI or Angular, then if you use require, you need to provide a shim of some sort or like a wrapper for it, and it's a little bit of work. So there's also modules coming in the next version of JavaScript and Harmony. So I don't think there's like the right or wrong solution. The one I opted for was obviously using common JS style requires on the server, using essentially just concatenation for the sort of libraries like jQuery, Angular, and so on. Because if you try and wrap them, it gets really hairy very quickly, and there's no real benefit to doing that. And then for my own sort of application code, which thanks to the whole sort of 80% of your app is used for DOM manipulation, is actually 20% of what the app would be in another framework, is actually very small. But nonetheless, for that, I use kind of common JS modules, and I precompile them into a single JavaScript file for the client. And there's like a thing I've open sourced called Join.js on GitHub that does all that. So this kind of leads us nicely into the build system. And I guess the main ones are Yeoman from Google. We've got Grunt. There's a bunch of others. Some people write their own. I chose not to have a build process. Or rather, the building is kind of done at runtime. So the Join.js is the thing that does the build for you. And it's done kind of lazily as the resources are requested. So it also does some optimizations, including minification. This is the shortest man in the world and the tallest man who didn't quite fit. There's a better picture, which was more like horizontal, or like landscape mode, with the tallest woman and the shortest woman, but that was a bit risque, so you can Google it yourself if you want. Anyhow, minification. So Uglify used for JS, but actually a lot of libraries do provide you with a min.js file. And if you just sort of pass them through Uglify, you're going to get all sorts of debug strings and pretty error message stuff included in there. So I used like the min.js whenever it's available or if it's available. And there's obviously other choices like Clojure compiler, which is used by Yeoman, YUI compressor, etc. Then there's Clean CSS, which cleans up your CSS. And there's also other compressors, but some are more experimental. And I like being at the cutting edge. I'm like on a master, GitHub master of Angular, but you really don't want to be debugging or CSS any more than you have to with CSS issues. So clean CSS is pretty straightforward, doesn't do anything too fancy. And it's also the reason I opted not to use HTML minifier, which tries to remove like unnecessary white spaces, because that goes wrong quite easily. Okay, now let's talk about optimizing your application. Right? Because obviously, from day one, I assumed that my application, the moment somebody hears about it, it's going to spread like wildfire. So, I had prepared a data center. I was all set up, ready to go. And, I spent a lot of time optimizing this because, most people sort of do tend to do this. Like, they tend to prefer to do what they're good at, and they don't actually try and do the things that are like chores or a little bit annoying. Talking to people, not so much fun. Optimizing your site, different story. So, so there's a few things that might be useful to some of you. I don't know. So first of all, I guess the first takeaway is, the network is the biggest issue. So network latency. and if you have lots of resources, that's bad. So you want to minimize the number of resources and the order in which the resources are loaded. And I could repeat those reasons, but you probably know, or like the cases, and you probably know most of them. The long and the short of it is you should basically look at YSlow, DevTools, and Google's PageSpeed, right? Another thing that I did, which I thought was pretty clever, and it's taken, I stole it from somewhere else, but still, I thought it was clever, was to split up the libraries and application. Because your app changes like multiple times a day, at least it does for me. Your libraries change like once a month, or once every couple of months, and they're much bigger. So having your app separate from your libraries is good, because the libraries end up being cached. You should also use gzip. That's easy to enable. I kind of run Nginx in front of Node.js. And also, with Nginx, it's easy to get set up Speedy, which is Google's protocol, which kind of multiplexes the HTTP streams and optimizes away the headers if they're the same headers sent back and forth. There's also caching, which is probably the most single most useful, but also is kind of dangerous optimization technique. But you should kind of be careful with how you tune those knobs. So let's talk about that. So IE doesn't, or IE rather caches XHR GET requests, which means for all API calls, you actually want to have cache control, no cache. And for everything else, which are like the static assets, and I mean everything else, including all the client-side JavaScript, should be cached with the far off expires header. You should also use e-tags, because that means that you don't have to, if the browser makes a request, the file hasn't changed, then it doesn't send the whole body back down. And but if you want this to work with a content distribution network, you should include the e-tag in the CDN. So that's something that kind of Join.js also does. Application cache, HTML5 feature, is kind of nice, but it's a real pain when you misconfigure it during development and it doesn't do what you want to do, because expunging the files from that cache is really difficult. So for the time being, I've opted not to use it. And yeah, everything is served through a CDN, so CloudFront, and it's not that expensive. And it's a huge difference, right? Because when you serve a file from the US, which is where like the API is hosted in the Amazon US East data center, then what you end up having is like a 150 millisecond latency. When you use a CDN, it's 8 milliseconds. One interesting thing to note is the CDN has this setting, Europe and US only. And funnily, I guess Americans don't think Finland is in Europe or something, but if you enable that, then you still have 150 milliseconds latency. So if you enable global, however, then it works. So a little tip there. Should save you a bit of time and effort, if you try and save money on this. Anyway, long story short, we kind of have this thing that's been built. I've kind of let people know about it. And unfortunately, it looks a little bit like this. It's a ghost town. Nobody's actually checking out my site. So like as an afterthought, I thought I'll get the survey out, and this was mentioned, like you don't want to interview 50 people. Well, I didn't want to go on the street either, but I did get 40 survey responses to a survey I sent out. And it turned out that actually, well, what I was offering wasn't sufficiently better than what people were doing with Chrome's new tab feature. Plus, there's no reason for people to keep coming back. So there's a few users, but there isn't a whole lot of activity. But what I did discover, and I really regret not doing the survey later. I should really practice as I preach, but the whole lean startup sort of methodology. What I did find was that people find it a real problem, right, to discover web apps. Because Chrome App Store, Facebook Store don't really solve the real problem. So what I'm going to be building next is going to be essentially a web application directory. Funny thing is, a web app directory is something that totally does not require HTML5. In fact, or any of the like push state features, you name it. It's completely anti-HTML5 because you want it to be indexable by Google. Now, Google does occasionally index JavaScript, but it's a bit hit and miss. So what I really want is to generate the HTML server side. So essentially for that, I'm using Mustache, still using Common Node with Stick. And the HTML5 part of the app is still going to stick around, but like really the focus is shifted to a more traditional kind of web application. So in conclusion, I guess the takeaways here are, validate your assumptions first. So don't build something using some fancy new technology just because it's available. Make sure you're building, and solving a real pain So sort of you're offering aspirins rather than vitamins. You should also question your beliefs. So I was very sort of against frameworks. I had nothing against dollhouses, but I was sort of, and this isn't how I've been brought up, this isn't the right way to do things, but actually Angular is surprisingly great. And although there is like dark magic under the hood, it means that I can develop much faster and I can iterate and test things out. But you're definitely going to have to assemble your own framework on any project. So you're going to have build up your own toolkit. And you sort of want to add bits to your toolkit, like tools, as you go along. You don't want to kind of put everything in there because that's unnecessary complexity. So your kind of toolkit should evolve with your project. And sometimes it's good to reinvent the wheel. So an interesting example is, in HTML5, you've got the input placeholder element, or attribute rather. And obviously, if you want that to work in older browsers, you need to provide a shim. So the jQuery plugin that does it is like this 200 lines of code that overrides some jQuery getters. And as a result, well, it's overly complicated. It doesn't work with Angular because Angular maintains its own state and doesn't expect jQuery getters to be overridden. So when using that didn't work. So the solution there was to write an AngularJS directive, which ended up being like 5 lines of code. So it's OK to reinvent the wheel sometimes. And finally, I guess this has kind of been the takeaway from this whole day, really, is that I think we're just at the beginning, and we've got our work cut out for us. It's a never-ending journey, so really the one thing as developers that we should optimize for is development enjoyment. If you stop having fun as you're doing development, then you should start looking into other frameworks and tools. Thank you very much.